is going to talk to you early in the class about most of the community types that we're going to visit, but I'm going to talk about a couple of the more maritime areas, simply because I've spent a little bit more time in them. And I'm going to start by talking about barrier islands and beaches. Now, by way of disclosure, I'm using the PowerPoints that I developed for my subtropical ecology class, so a lot of the illustrations and examples are from Florida systems, but these systems are basically the same wherever you find them, and I think we can make the comparison between Alabama and Florida. I have added a couple of slides, and you'll be able to recognize those when you see them. But barrier islands and beaches are not tremendously common in most areas of the world. They're offshore of about 10% of the world's coast, but they are particularly important off of the U.S. Atlantic coast, particularly the lower part of it, and the Gulf Coast. And around the northern rim of the Gulf, barrier islands are the norm rather than the exception. Most barrier islands have characteristic systems, and you're looking here at a diagram where we're going from the ocean or the Gulf over here on the right side, and we're moving in toward the beach. And right here in the intertidal zone, there's often a rack line. Rack is stuff that washes up on the beach. There's usually a crest here called the berm, and that's an erosional crest, and then something of a flat forebeach that often in a classic barrier island will transition into what we call the foredunes, which are often quite high, but in too many cases along the Gulf they've been either destroyed by human activity or have been demolished by hurricanes in many areas. Behind that there may be an interdune area that may be a forest or a bog, what is sometimes referred to as swale, back dunes, and then often on the rear side of the barrier island there is a tidal marsh, and then behind that is a protected lagoon. For example, in the case of Dauphin Island, the rear side of it is protected as Mississippi Sound. Typical barrier island, again, just another illustration, and we will be looking at some of the characteristic vegetation. There's not much vegetation, if any, on the open beach, but as you get into the dunes there is some characteristic vegetation there. Another look, and this actually, here we've got the foredune and we've got this swale area protected between the dune systems. Swale is a marshy, freshwater, largely freshwater system. We will see dune and swale systems, barrier islands and beaches, probably in the Bon Secour area on Fort Morgan Peninsula. This, of course, is the beach looking out toward the Gulf of Mexico. This is the swale area behind the dunes. I think I'll just skip this slide. This is dealing specifically with Florida, indicating that you tend to get barrier islands in regions that are high energy. So if you just continued this on over into coastal Alabama, you've got essentially the same systems over here that you would have in the Florida Panhandle. We find sandy beaches in areas that have high energy shorelines. So for example, you see that along the Florida coast you get sandy beaches and barrier islands down until you get past the Port St. Joe, and actually right here around the area of Sanibel, not Sanibel, Carabel. That's about the extent of it as you go into the Big Bend of Florida. And then you begin to get into sandy beaches again as you move down toward the lower part of the peninsula. In Florida, beaches are primarily composed of quartz sand in the north, and that's the situation in Alabama. As you go further south, you get more calcium carbonate. Since the waves are responsible, barrier islands are a dynamic structure. They're constantly moving, constantly being reformed, and that's all, of course, due to the action of the waves. And the waves, as they angle in toward the beach, create a longshore current, which carries water down the beach, and so the beach is constantly being transported downward, especially in situations where it's a soft sand beach. And for example, these are the Panhandle beaches, which are made up of 99% quartz sand. There are a number of ideas about how barrier islands form. The most widely accepted of those ideas is what's called the mainland beach detachment hypothesis. The idea there is that you have spits that grow from headlands, and gradually these underwater shoals emerge, and as the mainland is isolated with rising sea level, the barrier island is left offshore, and this barrier island actually migrates inward. It essentially chases the retreating mainland with rising seawater. Typically, dunes are built as stems of dune grass accumulate, and their root system increases the surface roughness, allows a little bit of topography, and that allows the deposition of sand in the depressions, the small irregularities on the surface of the dunes. You can only build dunes with onshore winds, and thankfully there are strong and fairly consistent onshore winds. There is a threshold wind speed that's needed. That's in the neighborhood of 6 meters per second, which is a little bit over 13 miles per hour, to build dunes on barrier islands. Typically, the beach that faces the prevailing wind will have higher foredunes, and they're also much more likely to experience what are called blowouts, which is the movement of sand beyond the foredune area into the back dune area. On the panhandle of Florida, and this would be true in Dauphin Island, for example, as well, and on the peninsula at Fort Morgan, the southward facing coast has light southerly winds, but the particles making up those beaches are smaller. Therefore, they're a little bit easier to move, and as a result, you'd get quite large, or can get quite large foredunes there in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 meters tall. Barrier islands, as I mentioned, are constantly being moved. Most beaches in Florida, and this is certainly true down at Dauphin Island as well, they have been eroding landward at an average rate of about a ½ meter per year. And you can certainly see, I'm not sure where this is, but if you go to Dauphin Island, you will see very similar sorts of views as the beach moves landward. The passes, the inlets also will move if you allow them. Longshore currents will take sand from the upflow side and deposit it downflow, and so these passes have to be kept open and have to be maintained by the presence of jetties and periodically dredged. Alabama and Mississippi are quite lucky in the abundance of barrier islands. Mississippi in particular has Cat Island and Ship Island and Horn Island, Pettiboy, and then if you get far enough over, that may just be the little tip of what is now the western part of Dauphin Island. And the Gulf Islands National Seashore has been established to help protect a lot of those areas. It actually extends over into the Florida Panhandle as well. Areas of Santa Rosa Island in the Florida Panhandle are part of the National Seashore as well. All barrier islands have different sorts of vegetation zones, but there are typically some patterns. I'm going to show you a pattern here that's actually from a barrier island off of the Indian River Lagoon, which is on the Atlantic coast of Florida, but it gives you a good idea about how strongly zoned these systems are. On these islands, you can recognize what's called the foredune region, which has characteristic vegetation, which I'll show you in a second. You move behind that into what's called the dune crest, and in that region, it's heavily there's a lot of saw palmetto there. The back dune area there is characterized by a number of things, including cabbage palms. These islands often have a live oak forest as you move toward the lagoon system, and then in this area, the shoreline of the lagoon, the Indian River, which is on the side away from the Atlantic, in this region it has mangroves. We don't have mangroves in coastal Alabama, at least not yet, but in that situation you would find salt marsh vegetation. Some of the characteristic plants here just to show you what they look like, and some of these we will see. I'm not sure about all. Dr. Keener can probably chime in here and tell you what we might encounter and what we might not encounter, but we certainly will see sea oats, which are a foredune plant. In the Indian River barrier islands, railroad vine is quite common. As you move into the dune crest, those islands have sea grape, which I don't believe we'll encounter on the Alabama coast. Saw palmetto quite common. Moving to the back dune, we get there cabbage palm, and oftentimes we see prickly pear cactus. I'm also not sure that either of these is going to be common in any of the beaches that we would visit. Live oak hammocks, and then the mangroves to the rear. I know we won't see those. Island building. Here's a great example of this sort of dune and swale system. This is at St. Vincent Island, which is down in the Florida Panhandle. Here's the current beach, and you can see old beaches here, secondary dunes to the rear here, and each one of these you'd have a dune ridge and then a low area behind it. Skip that. Just another look at barrier island structure. Here we're on the ocean or Gulf side. Here's the berm crest. That would be the area that the water is, the waves are breaking on, or breaking here and lapping up here. The back shore, the dunes, and then the various wetland areas behind them until you eventually reach the lagoon behind it. Just another profile here, classic sort of look. Beach, dunes with the swales, perhaps a dune forest. You might find a freshwater pond on the rear. In fact, Caitlin is working in some of the freshwater ponds that are protected on Santa Rosa Island. And then perhaps salt marsh as you move into the lagoon system. Just show you a few of the things that we might see. This is Uniola paniculata, sea oat, which is a classic pioneer plant on barrier islands. Beach morning glory, common vining plant. Dr. Keener, feel free to chime in here. In fact, I'm tempted to just show the slides and let him talk about them briefly. In fact, I think that's what I'm going to do. So go for it, Dr. Keener. Here we have cockspur prickly pear, Opuntia, and I shouldn't say. I suspect we might get some of that. In flower. Here's railroad vine, very common along the Atlantic beaches. This is from the textbook I use for subtropical, and it includes a number of vegetation profiles across beaches. The only one I'm going to show you here is number 9, which is going to be most similar to what you might see on an Alabama beach. That's at St. Vincent Island. This is St. Vincent Island. It's a beautiful location. We actually visit St. Vincent in the subtropical class. So here we go. This is the profile at St. Vincent, looking south. This would be the Gulf out here. This area that used to be the Four Dunes has been largely flattened by hurricanes. Then you get into a region that dominated by woody goldenrod, a rosemary zone behind that, a tall oak scrub behind that,